My name is Seren Matthews. I'm 29 years old, and 2 weeks ago I received the most shocking legal document of my life. My biological parents, who abandoned me when I was 4 and haven't spoken to me in 25 years, were suing me for $2.7 million that my grandfather left me in his will. The same grandfather who raised me after they disappeared from my life without a trace. The irony was suffocating. The people who couldn't be bothered to raise me now wanted the money from the man who actually did. Before we dive into this wild ride of family betrayal and sweet justice, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if you're ready to hear how blood money turned into the ultimate family karma story, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this tale of abandonment, greed, and unexpected justice is about to get absolutely insane. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. I was 4 years old when my parents David and Linda Matthews decided that parenting was too inconvenient for their lifestyle. My mother was 23, obsessed with her social media presence before social media was even really a thing, and my father was 25, chasing get-rich-quick schemes that never panned out. They were young, selfish, and completely unprepared for the responsibility of a child who required actual attention and care. The abandonment wasn't dramatic, no screaming fights or tragic accidents. One Thursday morning in October 2000, they simply packed their belongings while I was sleeping and left me alone in our shabby apartment. When I woke up confused and calling for mommy, all I found was a hastily scribbled note that said, "We can't do this anymore. Your grandpa will take care of you now." That was it. 25 years of my life summarized in one cruel sentence. My paternal grandfather Thomas Matthews found me 3 days later when the neighbors finally called him, concerned about the crying child they kept hearing through the thin walls. I'll never forget the look on his face when he discovered me, hungry, scared, and clutching a stuffed elephant that had become my only comfort. Grandpa Tom was 65 then, a retired military veteran who had planned to spend his golden years traveling with his late wife before she passed away from cancer the year before. Instead, he got an abandoned granddaughter and the responsibility of single-handedly raising a traumatized preschooler. The man who saved me wasn't wealthy by any means, but he was rich in character. He worked part-time at the local hardware store to make ends meet while caring for me. Every morning he'd make me breakfast, braid my hair with the patience of a saint, and walk me to school holding my tiny hand in his calloused one. He taught me to ride a bike, helped with homework, attended every parent-teacher conference, and somehow managed to create a stable, loving home despite our limited resources. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was how completely my parents vanished. They didn't call on my birthday, didn't send Christmas cards, didn't check if I was alive or dead. For all practical purposes, David and Linda Matthews ceased to exist in my world the moment they walked out that door. Grandpa Tom tried to track them down, initially believing they might have a change of heart, but they had disconnected their phone numbers, abandoned their apartment lease, and essentially evaporated into thin air. During my elementary school years, I used to fantasize that they would return. Maybe they had suffered some kind of accident or amnesia, and once they remembered me, they'd come back with tearful apologies and explanations that would make everything okay. I practiced what I would say to them, imagined the hugs and the family reunions. But years passed and the fantasy slowly died as reality set in. They simply didn't want me. Grandpa Tom became my entire world. He was father, mother, cheerleader, and best friend, all rolled into one incredible human being. When I cried about not having real parents like the other kids, he would sit me down and explain that families aren't always about blood, they're about who shows up, who stays, and who loves you unconditionally. He taught me that actions speak louder than genetics, and that the people who choose to love you are often more valuable than those who are obligated to by biology. As I grew older, I stopped asking questions about my parents. The pain of their abandonment never fully disappeared, but it transformed into something else: determination. I was going to prove to myself and the world that I could succeed despite their rejection. I threw myself into academics, sports, and eventually my career, always with Grandpa Tom cheering me on from the sidelines. He never missed a single milestone from high school graduation to my college acceptance letter to my first job promotion. The financial struggles were real during those early years. Grandpa Tom stretched every dollar shopped at thrift stores and sometimes skipped meals to make sure I had everything I needed. We lived in his small two-bedroom house, and while it wasn't fancy, it was filled with more love and stability than many mansions. He taught me the value of money, hard work, and gratitude for what we had, rather than resentment for what we lacked. What I didn't know during all those years was that my parents had been monitoring our lives from a distance. Not out of love or concern, but for entirely different reasons that would only become clear decades later. They knew about Grandpa Tom's military pension, his modest savings, and apparently they had been keeping tabs on his financial situation while remaining completely absent from mine. The depth of their selfishness and calculated indifference would eventually shock even me, and I thought I had already plumbed the depths of their callousness. By the time I turned 18, I had become fiercely independent, partly by necessity and partly as a defense mechanism against ever being abandoned again. Grandpa Tom had instilled in me a work ethic that bordered on obsessive, and I channeled all my energy into creating a successful life that would honor his sacrifices. I received a full academic scholarship to State University where I studied business administration with a minor in finance, graduating summa cum laude with a 3.9 gigapascals. College was where I first started to understand the full scope of what Grandpa Tom had given up for me. While my dormmates complained about helicopter parents and family drama, I video called my grandfather every Sunday, grateful for the steady presence he had provided throughout my childhood. He was so proud of my achievements that he kept a scrapbook of my academic awards, newspaper clippings from Dean's List announcements, and photos from every graduation ceremony. During my junior year, I met Marcus, my future husband, in an economics class. He came from a large, chaotic, loving family that initially overwhelmed me with their constant communication and involvement in each other's lives. The first time I attended a family dinner at his house, watching his parents, siblings, aunts, and uncles all talking over each other, sharing stories, and genuinely caring about each other's daily dramas, I felt like an anthropologist studying an alien species. This was what normal families looked like, and I had never experienced anything like it. Marcus was patient with my emotional walls and family baggage. When I explained my childhood and the abandonment, he didn't pity me or try to fix anything. Instead, he helped me see that my resilience and independence were strengths, not defenses. His family embraced me completely, and for the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to be part of a large supportive network. His mother, Patricia, often joked that she had gained a daughter who was more organized than all her biological children combined. After graduation, I landed a position at a mid-sized marketing firm in downtown Seattle, starting as a junior account executive with a modest salary but excellent growth potential. The work was demanding but rewarding, and I discovered I had a natural talent for understanding consumer behavior and developing successful campaigns. Within 3 years, I had been promoted twice and was managing accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Grandpa Tom's health began declining when I was 25. The years of physical labor, military service, and the stress of single parenting had taken their toll on his body. He developed arthritis that made his daily activities increasingly difficult, and his doctor recommended he consider assisted living options. The conversation where he first mentioned this possibility was one of the most difficult of my life, because I realized that the man who had saved me was now depending on me to save him. I immediately moved back home to take care of him, commuting an hour each way to work so I could be there for his medical appointments, grocery shopping, and daily care. Marcus supported this decision completely, often driving over after work to help with yard work, home repairs, and keeping Grandpa Tom company. During this period, I saw a different side of my grandfather, not just the strong provider and protector I had always known, but a vulnerable human being who was proud, scared, and grateful all at once. The caregiving period strengthened our bond even further. We spent long evenings talking about life, his military service, his marriage to my grandmother, and his dreams for my future. He told me stories about my father as a child that painted a picture of a boy who had always been selfish and entitled, expecting the world to revolve around his needs without considering consequences or responsibilities. It helped me understand that their abandonment wasn't a reflection of my worth but a revelation of their character. During one of these conversations, Grandpa Tom mentioned that he had been updating his will and financial arrangements. He had never been wealthy, but decades of careful saving, his military pension, and the small inheritance from my grandmother had accumulated into a modest nest egg. He wanted to make sure everything was properly arranged so that I would inherit his assets without complications when the time came. At that point, his estate was worth approximately $180,000, not a fortune, but enough to provide security and honor his lifetime of sacrifices. What neither of us realized was that my parents had somehow become aware of his financial planning. Through means I would only discover later, they had learned about his assets and had been waiting for the perfect moment to resurface in our lives. Their timing, as I would soon discover, was not coincidental. They had spent 25 years ignoring my existence, but they had apparently been very interested in monitoring the financial situation of the man who had raised me in their absence. The irony was devastating. While I was sacrificing my career advancement and personal time to care for the grandfather who had always been there for me, my biological parents were scheming about how to profit from his death. The contrast between unconditional love and calculated greed couldn't have been starker, and the revelation of their true motives would soon shatter any remaining illusions I might have harbored about their capacity for human decency. Everything changed in March 2023 when Grandpa Tom received a phone call that would transform our modest life into something neither of us had ever imagined. The call was from a lawyer representing the estate of his older brother Henry Matthews, who had died 6 months earlier in Arizona. Uncle Henry had been something of a family mystery. A brilliant engineer who had worked in the aerospace industry for 40 years, lived frugally, never married, and had minimal contact with relatives. Grandpa Tom hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, and I had only met him twice in my entire life. The lawyer's news was staggering. Uncle Henry had left his entire estate to Grandpa Tom, and that estate was worth $2.7 million. Apparently, Henry had been extremely successful in his career, had invested wisely in technology stocks during the boom years, owned several properties, and had lived well below his means for decades. The inheritance included his primary residence, 2 rental properties, a substantial investment portfolio, and significant cash savings. When Grandpa Tom hung up the phone after that life-changing conversation, we both sat in stunned silence for nearly 10 minutes. Neither of us could comprehend that our financial worries had not just disappeared but had been replaced by wealth beyond our wildest dreams. The man who had worked part-time at a hardware store to support me was suddenly a multi-millionaire, and the granddaughter who had been eating ramen noodles through college was about to inherit generational wealth. The timing felt like divine intervention. Grandpa Tom's medical expenses had been mounting, and I had been considering taking out loans to ensure he received the best possible care. Now suddenly we could afford the finest assisted living facilities, private nurses, experimental treatments, or whatever might improve his quality of life. The financial stress that had been a constant background anxiety throughout my entire life simply evaporated overnight. But Grandpa Tom, ever the practical military man, immediately wanted to update his will to ensure that I would inherit everything when he passed away. He had no other close relatives, no debts, and no complicated relationships that would require careful consideration. His wishes were simple. Everything should go to the granddaughter who had been his pride and joy for 25 years. Who had sacrificed her career to care for him, and who had never once complained about the modest circumstances of our shared priest and Podix life. Within 2 weeks we had met with an estate attorney, updated all his legal documents, and properly transferred Uncle Henry's assets into Grandpa Tom's name. The lawyer emphasized the importance of having everything clearly documented, especially given the substantial value of the estate. We laughed about the paranoia, joking about imaginary relatives crawling out of the woodwork to claim inheritance money from people they had never cared about in life. If only we had known how prophetic that joke would prove to be. Grandpa Tom's health took a turn for the worse just 3 months after receiving the inheritance. The excitement and stress of the sudden wealth change, combined with his ongoing medical issues, led to a series of complications that landed him in the hospital for 2 weeks. During his recovery, he kept insisting that we needed to make sure all the legal paperwork was absolutely bulletproof, as if he sensed that challenges might be coming. This is where our story takes its most dramatic turn, and where the true character of my biological parents would finally be revealed after 25 years of silence. Because somehow through methods I still don't fully understand, David and Linda Matthews had learned about the inheritance. They knew about Uncle Henry's estate, they knew about Grandpa Tom's updated will, and they knew that their abandoned daughter was about to inherit $2.7 million from the grandfather who had raised her in their absence. The vultures, it seemed, had been circling all along, waiting for exactly this moment to swoop down and claim a feast they had never earned and didn't deserve. Grandpa Tom passed away peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in November 2024. Just 8 months after receiving Uncle Henry's inheritance. I was holding his hand when he took his final breath, and his last words to me were, "You're the best thing that ever happened to my life, sweetheart. Don't let anyone tell you different." The funeral was beautiful, attended by neighbors, his friends from the hardware store, Marcus's entire family, and dozens of people whose lives he had touched through his quiet acts of kindness and service. What should have been a time of grieving and celebrating a life well lived was about to become a legal nightmare that would test everything Grandpa Tom had taught me about resilience, integrity, and fighting for what's right. Because 2 days after his funeral, as I was still processing the loss of the only real parent I had ever known, the doorbell rang and I found myself face to face with a process server holding documents that would change everything. The lawsuit papers were thick, official, and absolutely shocking in their audacity. David and Linda Matthews, represented by what appeared to be an expensive law firm, were claiming that they deserved a significant portion of their father's estate as his surviving children. They argued that his will was invalid, that I had unduly influenced him, and that they were entitled to their rightful inheritance as his biological offspring. The amount they were seeking: exactly $2.7 million, every penny that had originally come from Uncle Henry's estate. Reading those legal documents felt like being punched in the stomach while simultaneously having my heart ripped out. The language was cold, clinical, and absolutely vicious in its accusations. According to their lawsuit, I was a manipulative granddaughter who had isolated Grandpa Tom from his loving children and coerced him into leaving me an inheritance that rightfully belonged to them. They claimed that they had attempted to maintain contact over the years, but that I had interfered with their relationship. Every single allegation was not just false, it was the complete opposite of reality. These people had abandoned their child and disappeared for 25 years, never once attempting contact, never sending a birthday card, never checking if I was alive or dead. Now they were portraying themselves as devoted children who had been kept away by their own daughter's manipulation. The sheer audacity was breathtaking, but the pain of their lies cut deeper than I had expected. Marcus found me on the kitchen floor that evening, sobbing over the legal papers and shaking with rage. The grieving process for Grandpa Tom had barely begun, and now I was being forced to defend his memory and his final wishes against the very people who had made his guardianship necessary in the first place. The timing felt intentionally cruel, as if they had calculated that hitting me during my most vulnerable moment would increase their chances of success. Our first meeting with my attorney, Janet Rodriguez, was both enlightening and terrifying. Janet specialized in estate litigation and had seen plenty of family drama over inheritance money, but even she seemed shocked by the circumstances of this case. She explained that while the claims were clearly frivolous, defending against them would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. The legal system unfortunately doesn't always distinguish between legitimate claims and opportunistic money grabs until after extensive litigation. The discovery process began immediately, and that's when the true scope of my parents' deception started to become clear. Their legal team demanded access to all of Grandpa Tom's financial records, medical records, and personal communications going back 5 years. They wanted proof of every conversation we'd had, every medical decision we'd made together, and every detail of his estate planning process. It felt like they were trying to put our entire relationship on trial, searching for any tiny inconsistency they could exploit. But discovery works both ways, and Janet's investigation into my parents' lives revealed information that would prove crucial to our defense. Over the past 25 years, David and Linda had moved frequently, changed jobs constantly, and had accumulated significant debt through poor financial decisions and failed business ventures. They had never attempted to contact Grandpa Tom, never inquired about my well-being, and had actually actively avoided any situation where they might be asked to take responsibility for their abandoned daughter. Most damaging to their case was the revelation that they had hired a private investigator 6 months before Grandpa Tom's death, right after news of Uncle Henry's inheritance had somehow reached them. The private investigator's reports, which we obtained through legal discovery, showed detailed surveillance of our daily routines, Grandpa Tom's medical appointments, and even our meetings with the estate attorney. They had been watching us, gathering intelligence and planning their legal strategy while we were completely unaware of their existence. The paper trail was devastating to their claims of being loving children who had been kept away. Credit card records showed they had lived less than 200 miles away for the past 10 years, close enough to visit regularly if they had wanted to maintain a relationship. Phone records showed no attempts to contact either Grandpa Tom or me. Social media posts showed them living lavish lifestyles, taking expensive vacations, and bragging about financial windfalls from various schemes, all while claiming they were too poor to maintain contact with family. As the legal battle intensified, more ugly truths emerged. Their attorney had clearly advised them to present themselves as reformed, caring parents who had made mistakes in their youth but had grown into responsible adults who deserved recognition and inheritance. They submitted character references from friends who claimed they had always spoken lovingly about their daughter and father. They provided bank statements showing recent charitable donations and community involvement, clearly trying to construct a false narrative of responsibility and maturity. But Janet's team uncovered a very different story. Public records showed multiple bankruptcies, tax liens, and civil judgments against them for unpaid debts. Former employers described them as unreliable and dishonest. Neighbors complained about property damage, noise violations, and general disrespect for community standards. This wasn't a story of young parents who had made a mistake and grown from it. This was a pattern of irresponsible, selfish behavior that had continued for decades. The most infuriating aspect of their legal strategy was how they attempted to rewrite history. According to their version of events, they had been young and overwhelmed when they left me with Grandpa Tom, but had always intended it to be a temporary arrangement while they got back on their feet. They claimed they had sent money for my support. No evidence of this existed. Had tried to visit regularly. No evidence of this existed. And had been devastated when Grandpa Tom refused to allow contact, completely fabricated. Their lawyer's strategy was clearly to muddy the waters enough to create reasonable doubt about Grandpa Tom's motivations for his will. If they could convince a judge that there had been some kind of family estrangement caused by misunderstandings or my interference, they might be able to argue that his will didn't reflect his true wishes. It was a long shot, but with $2.7 million at stake, apparently worth pursuing regardless of the emotional damage it might cause. The stress of the lawsuit was overwhelming. Every day brought new legal documents, new depositions, new character attacks, and new lies to refute. I was spending thousands of dollars on attorney fees, taking time off work for court proceedings, and reliving the trauma of my abandonment through legal documentation and testimony. The inheritance that should have been a blessing was becoming a curse, and I started to understand why some people simply settle frivolous lawsuits rather than fight them. But giving up wasn't an option. This wasn't just about money, it was about honoring Grandpa Tom's memory and ensuring that his final wishes were respected. He had spent 25 years being the parent these people had refused to be, and they had no right to profit from his death. If I backed down now, I would be betraying everything he had taught me about standing up for what's right regardless of the cost. The turning point in the case came during David Matthews' deposition, when Janet Rodriguez asked a seemingly simple question that would unravel their entire legal strategy. She asked him to explain exactly how he had learned about his father's inheritance and why he had chosen that particular moment to re-establish contact after 25 years of silence. His answer would prove to be the smoking gun we needed to expose the true nature of their motivations. David stammered, contradicted himself, and finally admitted that they had received information about the inheritance from a family friend who had somehow learned about Uncle Henry's death and the subsequent windfall. When pressed for details about this mysterious friend, he became increasingly defensive and eventually revealed a connection that would prove devastating to their case. Linda's sister worked as a clerk in the probate court system, and she had illegally accessed confidential estate records to provide them with inside information. This revelation opened up an entirely new line of investigation that would expose the calculated, premeditated nature of their lawsuit. Janet's team discovered that Linda's sister Margaret had been systematically searching probate records for several years, looking for any Matthews family inheritances that might provide financial opportunities. She had flagged Uncle Henry's estate immediately when it appeared in the system and had provided detailed information about the inheritance amount, the timeline, and Grandpa Tom's role as beneficiary. The paper trail was extraordinary in its detail and devastating in its implications. Email records showed months of planning between David, Linda, and Margaret discussing the best strategy for claiming inheritance money from a father they had abandoned and hadn't spoken to in decades. They had researched estate law, consulted with multiple attorneys about their chances of success, and had even calculated the potential settlement amounts they might accept to avoid a lengthy trial. Most damning were the text messages between Linda and Margaret, which revealed their true feelings about both Grandpa Tom and me. Linda referred to her father as that stubborn old man, and expressed frustration that he had wasted money raising someone else's problem instead of saving it for his real children. She called me a manipulative little brat who had stolen their inheritance by playing the victim and taking advantage of an old man's guilt. The messages also revealed their backup plan. If the lawsuit failed, they intended to contest the will in multiple jurisdictions, file complaints with various regulatory agencies about the estate attorney's handling of the case, and potentially pursue criminal charges against me for elder abuse. They had researched my employer, my husband's business, and even our mortgage information, apparently planning to attack our lives from multiple angles if their initial legal strategy didn't succeed. When this information was presented to their attorney, he immediately requested a private meeting with Janet to discuss settlement options. It was clear that his clients had not been entirely honest with him about their motivations or their methods of obtaining information about the inheritance. The discovery of the illegal probate record access and the evidence of their true intentions had completely undermined their case and potentially exposed them to criminal liability. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. During Margaret's deposition, she revealed that this wasn't their first attempt to profit from family tragedies. Over the past 15 years, they had pursued inheritance claims against 3 other distant relatives, always using inside information from probate records, and always targeting estates where the legitimate heirs might be vulnerable to legal pressure. They had successfully extracted settlement payments from 2 previous cases, essentially making a living by preying on grieving families during their most vulnerable moments. The pattern was disgusting but consistent. They would identify estates with substantial assets and questionable family dynamics, file aggressive lawsuits with spurious claims, and then pressure the legitimate heirs into settlements to avoid prolonged legal battles. They had refined their approach over the years, learning exactly how much pressure to apply and how to present themselves as sympathetic figures who had been wronged by family circumstances. In my case, they had apparently believed they had found the perfect target, a young woman grieving the loss of her grandfather, inheriting money she had never expected, and lacking the family support system that might help her fight a prolonged legal battle. They had calculated that I would be overwhelmed by the legal process and would eventually settle for a substantial payment just to make the nightmare stop. What they hadn't anticipated was my determination to honor Grandpa Tom's memory, my husband's unwavering support, and Janet's skill at uncovering the truth. They also hadn't expected that their own greed and stupidity would create such a clear paper trail of their illegal activities and fraudulent motivations. Their attempt to steal my inheritance had instead exposed them as career scammers who had been exploiting the legal system for over a decade. The criminal implications were serious enough that Janet referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution. Margaret's illegal access to probate records was a felony, and the pattern of fraudulent inheritance claims could potentially be prosecuted as organized fraud or racketeering. David and Linda's involvement in the scheme made them accessories to these crimes, and their perjury during depositions added additional potential charges. As the walls closed in around them, their attorney made increasingly desperate settlement offers, eventually suggesting that they would drop their lawsuit entirely in exchange for me agreeing not to pursue criminal charges against them. The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted me to essentially pay them to stop trying to steal from me and to promise not to hold them accountable for their crimes, in exchange for them dropping their frivolous lawsuit. Janet's response was swift and unambiguous: absolutely not. We would see this case through to its conclusion, pursue all criminal charges to the fullest extent of the law, and make sure that their pattern of victimizing grieving families came to a permanent end. The time for settlements and compromises had passed the moment they decided to dishonor my grandfather's memory and exploit our family's tragedy for their personal profit. The final hearing took place on a cold February morning, exactly 1 year after I had first received their lawsuit papers. The courtroom was packed with supporters: Marcus and his entire family, my co-workers, neighbors who had known and loved Grandpa Tom, and even some of his old friends from the hardware store who wanted to see justice served for the man who had touched so many lives through his quiet kindness and integrity. Judge Catherine Morrison had clearly done her homework on this case. She had reviewed all the evidence, read every deposition, and studied the pattern of fraudulent behavior that Janet's investigation had uncovered. When David and Linda's attorney made his final arguments, essentially pleading for mercy and claiming his clients had been misguided rather than malicious, Judge Morrison's expression made it clear that she wasn't buying any of it. The judge's ruling was comprehensive, devastating, and absolutely satisfying. She not only dismissed their lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never file similar claims again, but she also awarded me attorney's fees, court costs, and punitive damages, totaling $85,000. She stated on the record that their case was frivolous, malicious, and an abuse of the legal system designed to exploit a grieving family member during her time of loss. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. She had clearly been personally offended by the circumstances of the case, and her final comments were directed specifically at David and Linda Matthews. She told them that their abandonment of their 4-year-old child was morally reprehensible, that their 25-year absence from their daughter's life was unconscionable, and that their attempt to profit from the death of the man who had stepped up to provide the parenting they had refused was one of the most shameful displays of greed and callousness she had encountered in 30 years on the bench. The criminal prosecution moved forward swiftly after the civil case concluded. Margaret was charged with computer fraud, identity theft, and abuse of public office. She ultimately pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, plus 5 years of probation. She also lost her job, her pension, and any future eligibility for public employment. Her career and reputation were permanently destroyed by her greed and willingness to break the law for her sister's schemes. David and Linda were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, perjury, and organized criminal activity based on their pattern of targeting multiple families. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against them and the potential for significant prison time, they accepted a plea deal that included 1 year in county jail, 3 years of probation, and an order to pay full restitution to all their previous victims. They were also required to perform 500 hours of community service and undergo financial counseling to address their pattern of irresponsible behavior. The restitution order was particularly satisfying because it meant they had to repay money they had stolen from other families over the years, effectively ensuring that their inheritance scam scheme had ultimately cost them far more than they had ever gained from it. The families they had previously victimized were contacted by prosecutors, and several of them chose to pursue additional civil litigation now that the criminal case had established a pattern of fraudulent behavior. The media attention was intense but generally supportive. Local news stations covered the story as an example of how the legal system can sometimes deliver true justice, and social media responses were overwhelmingly positive. People were outraged by the circumstances of my abandonment, and impressed by Grandpa Tom's lifetime of sacrifice and love. Many commenters shared their own stories of being raised by grandparents or other relatives who had stepped up when biological parents failed. 1 year later, my life has settled into a new normal that Grandpa Tom would have been proud of. I used part of the inheritance to establish the Thomas Matthews Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provides financial assistance to children being raised by grandparents or other non-parental relatives. The scholarship helps cover educational expenses, medical costs, and other needs that arise when extended family members take on unexpected parenting responsibilities. Marcus and I also bought a beautiful home with enough space to host his huge family for holidays and gatherings. We kept Grandpa Tom's old house as a rental property, with the income going directly to the scholarship fund. Every month we receive applications from families whose situations remind me of my own childhood, and we're able to provide help to kids who are being raised by people who chose to love them rather than people who were merely obligated to. The best part of this entire ordeal has been discovering how many lives Grandpa Tom actually touched during his 78 years on Earth. The scholarship fund has received donations from dozens of people who remembered his kindness, his work ethic, and his willingness to help others without expecting recognition or reward. Former customers from the hardware store shared stories of how he had helped them with projects, given advice, or simply listened when they needed someone to talk to. As for David and Linda Matthews, they served their jail time and disappeared back into whatever shadowy existence they had been living for the past 25 years. They violated their probation within 6 months of release, and were sent back to prison for the remainder of their sentences. Their criminal records ensure that they'll never again have access to the kinds of public information they used to target other families, and their names are now permanently associated with inheritance fraud in legal databases. The final irony is that their greed and callousness ultimately resulted in them paying me rather than the other way around. Between the punitive damages, the attorney fees they were ordered to pay, and the costs of their criminal defense, their scheme to steal my inheritance ended up costing them well over $100,000. They spent a year in jail, destroyed what remained of their reputations, and ensured that they'll never be able to exploit other grieving families the way they tried to exploit me. So, here's my question for all of you who followed this incredible journey of family karma and justice. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone who wronged you ended up facing consequences so perfectly fitting that it felt like the universe itself was delivering justice? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the best revenge really is just living well and letting karma do its work. If this story of abandonment, greed, and ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama that proves truth really is stranger than fiction. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually do win, and the people who try to profit from others' pain end up paying a price they never expected. Thank you for joining me on this wild ride through family betrayal and sweet revenge. From my heart to yours, I hope you never have to deal with people like my biological parents, but if you do, I hope you remember that standing up for what's right is always worth the fight. The love and sacrifice of people like Grandpa Tom should be protected and honored, and sometimes that means going to war with the vultures who think they can profit from that love. Here's to all the grandparents, aunts, uncles, and chosen family members who step up when biological parents step out. You are the real heroes, and your legacy of love is worth fighting for. Until next time, keep believing in justice, keep standing up for what's right, and remember that sometimes the best inheritance isn't money, it's the example of how to live with integrity, courage, and unconditional love.